Imagine waking up tomorrow and finding your cherished vintage car is suddenly illegal to drive. How would you feel if your beloved piece of history was taken from you? Well, it's not just a nightmare. The US government has proposed a sweeping ban on vintage cars, citing environmental concerns. By the year 2025, pre-modern vehicles could be forced off the roads entirely. But here's the catch. The cars being targeted make up only a tiny fraction of emissions. This has sparked outrage across the nation. Enthusiasts, historians, and small business owners are fighting back. Why? Because this ban could change the face of car culture forever. Is this ban a genuine step toward combating climate change, or is it just a symbolic move? What does this mean for car enthusiasts and the future of classic vehicles? Stay tuned, because we're diving into the real story behind the vintage car ban, and you won't want to miss it. What's happening? Critics argue that the policy could be symbolic rather than effective, questioning its real impact on climate change. The ban's rapid progression through legislative channels, with little room for debate, has left many wondering if alternative solutions, like retrofitting or stricter emissions testing, could be more effective and fair. The initial reaction from the car enthusiast community has been one of disbelief and anger. Social media platforms have lit up with posts from collectors and restorers sharing what their classic cars mean to them. For some, these vehicles are more than just modes of transportation. They're family heirlooms, symbols of freedom, and tangible connections to America's industrial past. The emotional stakes couldn't be higher. What's more shocking is how quickly this proposal gained traction. Environmental agencies and certain policymakers have pushed for aggressive timelines, leaving little room for public debate. The speed of this process has sparked fears that the voices of those most affected by the ban, enthusiasts, small business owners, and rural communities, are being overlooked. While the emotional and cultural implications are profound, the environmental argument is where the proposal seeks its strongest footing. But is this reasoning as solid as it seems? Environmental justifications. The proposal's environmental argument hinges on the claim that vintage vehicles, with their outdated technology, are significant contributors to pollution. Advocates point to the high levels of carbon emissions and inefficient fuel consumption of older cars as evidence that they must be phased out. But how accurate is this portrayal? Data on emissions from vintage cars paints a nuanced picture. While these vehicles do emit more carbon dioxide per mile than their modern counterparts, they are driven far less frequently. Most classic cars are used sparingly, appearing mainly at shows, parades, or on occasional joyrides. When compared to the daily emissions of millions of commuter vehicles, their environmental footprint is almost negligible. Environmental experts are divided. Some argue that targeting vintage cars is a distraction from addressing larger polluters, such as private jets, industrial operations, and shipping vessels. Others believe that every sector must contribute to reducing emissions, even if the impact of some measures is minimal. This debate highlights a key flaw in the proposal. It treats vintage cars as low-hanging fruit while leaving bigger polluters relatively unscathed. The proposal has also failed to account for the sustainability efforts already underway within the classic car community. Many enthusiasts are exploring ways to make their vehicles greener, from retrofitting engines with cleaner technology to using alternative fuels. These grassroots efforts suggest that there are paths to sustainability that don't require an outright ban. In light of this, the environmental justification for the ban begins to crumble. If classic cars are responsible for only a minuscule portion of emissions, why are they being targeted? The answer may lie not in their environmental impact, but in their symbolic value. And while the debate over emissions rages on, another storm is brewing, this time over the economic fallout of the proposed ban. Economic ripples. Could this ban devastate a multi-billion-dollar industry overnight? The collector car market is more than just a niche hobby. It's a vital economic engine that supports thousands of jobs and generates billions in revenue each year. From restoration shops and auction houses to tourism and memorabilia, the ecosystem surrounding vintage cars is vast and interconnected. Take, for example, the restoration industry. Small, family-owned businesses that specialize in breathing new life into aging vehicles could face closure if demand for their services plummets. These businesses not only provide skilled jobs, but also contribute to local economies, particularly in areas where manufacturing and industrial work have declined. Then there's the tourism impact. Events like car shows and auctions draw enthusiasts from across the country, filling hotels, restaurants, and local shops. Monterey Car Week in California, which features the prestigious Pebble Beach Concours d'Elegance, generates millions of dollars in tourism revenue annually. A ban on vintage cars could jeopardize these events, leaving towns and cities that rely on car-related tourism struggling to make ends meet. The ripple effects extend further. Classic cars are often seen as investments, with rare models fetching millions at auction. A sudden ban could render these assets worthless, leading to significant financial losses for collectors. This could have a chilling effect on the market, discouraging future investments and stifling innovation in restoration techniques. What's most troubling is the lack of consideration given to these economic consequences in the proposal's rollout. The focus has been squarely on environmental benefits, with little acknowledgement of the livelihoods that hang in the balance. It's a short-sighted approach that fails to account for the broader impact of such a sweeping policy. As the economic implications become clearer, resistance to the ban is growing, but the backlash isn't just about money, it's also about preserving a deeply ingrained piece of American culture, cultural significance. Vintage cars are more than just machines. They are rolling pieces of history that tell the story of America's innovation, artistry, and spirit of freedom. From the post-war boom that gave rise to the muscle car era to the golden age of road trips in the mid-20th century, these vehicles are woven into the fabric of American identity. For collectors, owning a classic car is often about more than aesthetics or performance. It's about connection. These vehicles serve as tangible links to the past, reminders of milestones in personal and national history. Take the story of a family that has passed down a 1955 Chevrolet Bel Air for 3 generations, using it to teach mechanical skills and share stories of bygone eras. Stories like these are common in the classic car community, underscoring the emotional and educational value of these vehicles. Classic cars also play a central role in community events. Parades, car shows, and educational programs for at-risk youth provide opportunities for people to come together, celebrate their shared passions, and learn valuable skills. These gatherings foster a sense of community that goes beyond the cars themselves, creating bonds that are difficult to quantify but impossible to ignore. A ban on vintage cars would threaten to erase this cultural heritage, silencing the engines that have carried generations into the future. It's a loss that extends far beyond the individual owners. It's a loss for everyone who values creativity, craftsmanship, and connection. As we've seen, the proposed ban raises questions that go beyond emissions and efficiency. It touches on deeper issues of freedom, identity, and community. The battle to preserve vintage cars is shaping up to be as much about values as it is about vehicles, and the stakes couldn't be higher. But is there more to this ban than meets the eye? Unmasking the motivations. The proposal to ban vintage cars has deeper layers beyond its stated environmental goals. At its core, this policy aligns with recent governmental efforts to accelerate sustainability initiatives, but the motivations driving it may be far from pure. Environmental lobbyists have exerted significant pressure on policymakers, leveraging public concern about climate change to push for radical changes. These groups often frame vintage cars as symbols of an unsustainable past, emphasizing the need for policies that represent progress toward a greener future. Yet this proposal also intersects with broader political agendas. It reflects the current administration's desire to demonstrate global leadership in environmental reform, particularly in international forums where countries compete to set ambitious climate targets. By targeting something as symbolic as vintage cars, the government can present itself as taking bold, decisive action. But is this really about climate leadership, or is it about optics? For some policymakers, this ban also serves as a way to appease specific voter bases. Younger, environmentally conscious demographics often see vintage cars as relics of a bygone era, associated with outdated ideals. By supporting such a policy, politicians can align themselves with modern progressive values, even if the actual environmental impact of the ban is negligible. This approach raises questions about whether these decisions are made in the public's best interest, or if they are calculated moves to secure political capital. Unveiling these hidden motivations reveals that the ban might be less about conservation and more about political strategy. By catering to certain voter groups and international commitments, the government risks alienating large segments of its population who see this policy as an attack on their personal freedoms and cultural heritage. The control debate. For many, this policy is reminiscent of historical examples where governments have used crises to justify increased control over individual choices. Critics argue that banning vintage cars sets a dangerous precedent. While the stated goal is to reduce emissions, the policy disproportionately targets a niche group of car enthusiasts who drive their vehicles infrequently. This raises suspicions that the government is using environmental concerns as a convenient pretext to expand its regulatory power. If this ban succeeds, what might be next? Could other personal personal hobbies or traditions face similar scrutiny under the guise of sustainability. Looking back, there are parallels in history where governments have overstepped boundaries under the guise of progress. From restrictions on certain forms of media to heavily regulated industries, these actions often began with justifiable intentions but later evolved into broader control mechanisms. The classic car ban could follow a similar trajectory, sparking concerns about how much influence the government should have over individual freedoms. At its heart, this debate highlights a growing tension between environmental priorities and personal liberties. While sustainability is a noble goal, the methods used to achieve it must respect the values and freedoms that define a democratic society. This policy, critics warn, could mark the beginning of a slippery slope where the pursuit of collective goals comes at the expense of individual rights. The scapegoat theory. Are classic cars being unfairly targeted? The ban on vintage vehicles raises an important question. Why focus on such a small segment of the population when there are far greater contributors to environmental degradation? This policy, some argue, represents a classic example of scapegoating, a strategy where a visible, symbolic target is blamed for a larger problem. Vintage cars make for an easy scapegoat. They are eye-catching, evoke nostalgia, and represent a tangible connection to the past. This makes them an ideal target for policymakers looking to signal action on climate change. However, the numbers tell a different story. Classic cars account for an almost negligible percentage of total vehicle emissions, given their limited usage and small population. Meanwhile, larger polluters such as heavy industries, commercial transportation, and even private jets continue to operate with relatively less scrutiny. By focusing public attention on vintage cars, policymakers can create the appearance of taking bold action without challenging these more significant contributors. This approach not only distracts from the real sources of pollution, but also alienates a passionate community that has little to do with the overarching problem. Highlighting this misplaced blame underscores the flaws in the proposed ban. Rather than targeting hobbyists who cherish their vehicles and use them sparingly, the government should focus on systemic changes that address larger, more impactful sources of emissions. The scapegoating of vintage cars may generate headlines, but it ultimately distracts from meaningful progress. Public backlash. The announcement of a potential vintage car ban has ignited a wave of public opposition across the country. Enthusiasts, small business owners, and everyday citizens are rallying together to protect a vital part of their cultural identity and personal freedom. Grassroots movements have emerged in response to the policy, with protests, petitions, and social media campaigns spreading rapidly. These efforts are not limited to car enthusiasts. They also include local communities that rely on classic car events for economic and social benefits. For many, this fight is about more than just vehicles. It is about preserving traditions, supporting small businesses, and resisting what they perceive as government overreach. Stories from these movements highlight the depth of opposition. In one town, a group of restoration shop owners banded together to organize a parade of vintage cars, drawing thousands of supporters. Social media platforms have become hotbeds of activity, with hashtags and viral posts amplifying the voices of those who feel their way of life is under threat. This growing public backlash is forcing policymakers to take notice. As protests gain traction and petitions gather signatures, the pressure on lawmakers to reconsider the ban is mounting. For many, this movement represents more than just a defense of classic cars. It is a broader fight for the values of freedom, heritage, and community. The public outcry serves as a powerful reminder that policies must consider the people they affect. By uniting in opposition, citizens are proving that collective action can challenge even the most ambitious governmental proposals. This resistance underscores the importance of balancing progress with respect for tradition and individual rights. Legal challenges. The proposed ban on vintage cars presents a host of legal challenges, questioning its compatibility with constitutional rights, including property rights and equal protection under the law. This is not a straightforward environmental measure, but a policy fraught with legal complexities. At its heart lies the question of private property rights. For many, vintage cars are not just sentimental items, but significant financial assets. Restricting their use could be seen as infringing on an owner's right to enjoy their property. Legal experts highlight past cases where courts limited regulatory overreach to protect such rights. Another critical issue is potential unequal enforcement. The ban targets vintage cars while sparing larger polluters like private jets and industrial operations, which could be argued as a violation of equal protection laws. Singling out classic car enthusiasts risks being deemed discriminatory. Historical precedents also point to potential hurdles. Environmental regulations have often faced legal challenges when they were not proportional to the the issues they sought to address. If the government fails to prove that banning vintage cars significantly reduces emissions, courts could strike the policy down as arbitrary and capricious. Additionally, the retroactive nature of the ban poses legal questions. Owners bought and maintained these vehicles under the assumption they could use them on public roads. Changing the rules after the fact could lead to lawsuits claiming an unlawful taking without just compensation, violating the Fifth Amendment. Procedural fairness is another potential flashpoint. Was the ban proposed and approved with adequate stakeholder consultation? Did it undergo rigorous cost-benefit analysis? If not, opponents could argue it lacks due diligence. Industry pushback. The automotive industry is far from idle in its opposition to the vintage car ban. Automakers, aftermarket suppliers, and restoration shops are leveraging their influence to challenge the policy on multiple fronts. Lobbying is a key strategy. Industry leaders are emphasizing the economic fallout the ban could cause, including the disruption of the classic car market and ripple effects on related sectors like restoration shops and specialty parts manufacturers. Many businesses in these sectors could face closure if the ban is implemented. Organizations like the Specialty Equipment Market Association are leading the charge. Known for championing automotive enthusiasts, they are advocating for exemptions that allow vintage cars to remain on the road, proposing limited use permits and incentives for eco-friendly retrofits such as electric conversions. Automakers, including legacy brands like Ford and General Motors, also have a stake in the debate. Vintage models are not just historical artifacts, but marketing assets that foster brand loyalty. Preserving these emotional connections is seen as essential for maintaining long-term customer relationships. The industry is also funding research into alternative solutions, such as carbon-neutral fuels and retrofitting technologies, to demonstrate that sustainability and vintage cars can coexist. These efforts aim to position the industry as proactive in addressing climate concerns while countering the ban's rationale. Public relations campaigns are another tool in the industry's arsenal. These campaigns emphasize the cultural and economic value of vintage cars, framing the ban as a short-sighted policy that ignores practical alternatives. By swaying public opinion, the industry hopes to pressure policymakers to reconsider. Media's role. The media plays a pivotal role in shaping the public discourse around the vintage car ban. Coverage has been extensive and polarizing, reflecting the emotional and economic stakes of the issue. Conservative outlets often frame the ban as government overreach, highlighting themes of personal freedom and economic harm. These stories frequently feature individual car owners or small businesses adversely affected by the policy, humanizing the debate to galvanize opposition. Progressive media, while supportive of environmental goals, has taken a more nuanced approach. Some outlets highlight the ban's fairness and practicality, offering expert opinions and data-driven analysis to present both sides of the issue. Sensationalism has also infiltrated the conversation, with headlines like "War on Vintage Cars" or "Classic Cars Under Siege," fueling emotional responses. While effective in grabbing attention, this framing risks inflaming tensions rather than fostering constructive dialogue. Social media has become a battleground for public opinion. Viral posts featuring images of pristine vintage cars with slogans like "Don't erase history" have mobilized grassroots opposition. Meanwhile, other campaigns focus on solutions, such as showcasing successful electric conversions and sustainable fuels, offering a more hopeful narrative. What about alternative solutions? Amid the heated debate, alternative solutions are emerging that balance environmental concerns with the preservation of automotive heritage. Policymakers, industry leaders, and advocacy groups are exploring compromises. One option is stricter emissions testing tailored specifically for vintage cars. This approach ensures classic vehicles meet environmental standards without drastic modifications. Tax credits or subsidies could incentivize compliance. Limited road usage is another viable compromise. Restricting vintage cars to specific days, locations, or events could minimize their environmental impact while allowing enthusiasts to continue enjoying their passion. Special permits or registration categories could facilitate this system. Electric conversions are gaining traction as a sustainable alternative. Companies specializing in retrofitting vintage cars with electric powertrains have shown that it is possible to preserve the look and feel of classic vehicles while reducing emissions. Although conversions are costly, subsidies or industry partnerships could make them more accessible. Synthetic fuels also hold promise as a long-term solution. Research into carbon-neutral fuels is advancing rapidly, potentially enabling internal combustion engines to operate with minimal environmental impact. If successful, this technology could allow vintage cars to remain on the road without contributing to climate change. Real-world examples demonstrate the viability of these solutions. In Germany, exemptions for vintage cars are paired with rigorous emissions testing, striking a balance between preservation and sustainability. These policies show that compromises are both possible and effective. Global trends and car culture's evolution. Worldwide, governments are introducing initiatives to curb emissions, some of which bear a striking resemblance to the proposed US vintage car ban. A notable example is London's ultra-low emission zone, where vehicles that don't meet emission standards face fines or are banned from certain areas. Although London's ultra-low emission zone has helped reduce pollution, it has drawn criticism from small businesses and residents affected by the financial burdens. In Germany, some cities have adopted environmental zones that restrict vehicles based on their emission ratings. Vintage car enthusiasts argue for exemptions, citing the cultural significance of these cars and their limited use. European governments have collaborated with car enthusiast groups to find compromises, such as offering special permits for vintage vehicles or allowing them to be driven on weekends and special events. While these policies show that emissions targeting regulations are not unique to the US, the outcomes and approaches vary. Some countries are striking a balance between environmental goals and the preservation of automotive heritage. As sustainability-focused transportation policies grow globally, the US has the opportunity to lead by example, creating inclusive, innovative solutions that respect both environmental concerns and cultural traditions. The future of car culture is intertwined with the rise of sustainable technologies. Electric vehicle conversions for vintage cars are one such innovation. By retrofitting older models with electric powertrains, companies are allowing classic vehicles to stay on the road without contributing to emissions. These conversions offer a new life for vintage cars, combining the nostalgia of the past with modern sustainability. Synthetic fuels also offer hope for the preservation of internal combustion engines in a carbon-neutral future. Major automakers, including Porsche, are investing in these fuels, which could allow traditional engines to run without harming the environment. Though still in development, synthetic fuels have the potential to sustain car culture without compromising climate goals. Digital platforms are further reshaping car culture. Virtual car shows and online communities provide a global space for enthusiasts to share their passion and knowledge. These innovations ensure that car culture remains vibrant even as physical restrictions evolve. The future of car culture will rely on adaptation and collaboration. Embracing new technologies, supporting innovation, and fostering a sense of community will enable car enthusiasts to preserve their passion while contributing to sustainability. It is a challenge, but one that offers an opportunity to redefine what it means to celebrate automotive heritage. Lessons from history and moving forward together. Have the challenges facing the vintage car market been encountered before? Automotive history reveals that today's struggles are not entirely unprecedented. In the 1970s, the introduction of strict emission standards led to significant changes in vehicle design. Automakers quickly adapted by developing catalytic converters and other technologies, which improved environmental outcomes while driving innovation. Initially met with resistance, these changes eventually led to cleaner vehicles and better engineering. Similarly, the fuel crisis of the 1970s pushed manufacturers to focus on fuel-efficient cars. This period gave rise to iconic compact cars and was a time of innovation driven by necessity. The current push for electric vehicles mirrors this era's challenges and opportunities. Once again, enthusiasts and manufacturers are showing that obstacles can be transformed into opportunities for progress. The debate over vintage cars is emotionally charged, but the lessons of history suggest that resilience and innovation will help overcome it. Automakers and enthusiasts have always found ways to adapt to new challenges while preserving their passion for vehicles. By looking back, we can find inspiration to navigate today's challenges and ensure both tradition and progress coexist. Moving forward, collaboration is key to preserving the past while embracing the future. Across the country, car enthusiasts, policymakers, and innovators are working together to create solutions that balance environmental concerns with the legacy of vintage vehicles. Advocacy groups are educating lawmakers about the cultural and economic value of classic cars, while technology companies develop affordable conversion kits and synthetic fuels to make sustainability more accessible. Grassroots campaigns and car club initiatives are also playing a crucial role in these efforts. These community-driven actions show that progress does not have to come at the cost of history. Instead, it can build upon the unique aspects of car culture that bring people together around a shared passion. Though the path forward is not without its challenges, it is full of promise, right? What do you think? Let's know in the comments.